Well, I was just nodding off to sleep, and it came to me how to maybe properly visualize what the Ammann brothers did in 1921. And in the course of fumbling around trying to put this together, I might have made one improvement, or I may have simply accurately depicted what they've done. The last thing, what I mean to say is the last thing I put in was this lamp shorting out the two inputs, and it gave better results, less confusion for the simulator. It actually computed or calculated nan infinite matrix, basically infinity, and all the components equally shared infinite values. The only difference was the current on the battery was negative, infinite negative current, but everything else was positive orientation. Now, you're not supposed to be able to feed a transformer a battery source, yet I know I've always managed to do so because I fake it by putting in a capacitor, 3 capacitors, and it ends up oscillating, and so it works just fine. And then I throw in some diodes to really skew things, because I suspect the Ammann brothers did make use of borax or baking soda diodes, using aluminum as the anode and some other metal, let's say lead, as the cathode, in an electrolyte solution of either baking soda or borax or both. And I thought I'd depict the battery, so let's zoom in on the battery readouts. So that's how infinitely long it just keeps going. And notice the current, the I, is negative, and the voltage difference is positive, and 0 ohms of resistance. Literally. Which is unusual. Now, I think it's spelled with a double N. A-double-M-A-double-N. The Ammann brothers. Anyway, so there's this newspaper article so I made it my desktop. I want to make sure I burn this into my brain. It's such a simple circuit. I used the default values for all of these components except for the resistors. Usually in Paul Fawcett Simulator, the resistors are 1,000 ohms, and I chose to use 1 ohm. But the capacitor, 10 microfarads. The transformer, I think it's 4 henries, 1-to-1 relationship. Now, in the real simulator that I made, this is version 4NL, which is not the same as the one I use on my website, 4NI, I believe. Well, I don't know. Whatever the one is on my website, it can't be the same because it gave slightly different results. Still basically infinity. What was I going to bring up? Oh, so I did it in the real simulator because it only works when there's equivalent series resistance in the capacitors and series resistance in the coils. So what I do is I approximate that any wire that's 25 gauge, 25 AUG, AWG, the resistance of 1 Henry coil is 1 ohm, which is fairly closely accurate. So if it's a if it's a microhenry, then it has a micro ohm of series resistance. If it's a 1,000 henries, then it's 1,000 ohms of resistance. For a 25 gauge wire, that comes out pretty close. So that's my default choice for coils. And then the capacitors, my default is 10 milliohms of equivalent series resistance, because I assume the worst case scenario for a ceramic capacitor. When I put in the lamp here across, it gave even better results. That's what was so cool about this. But basically, so since one of the Ammann brothers admitted to the use of iron, first prerequisite, wire, second prerequisite, and the third prerequisite was a mineral. And they didn't say what the mineral was, so I'm assuming the mineral is a common sense layperson choice of words for mineral, not calcium or sodium like we would say today, but more like the raw mineral from the earth, such as trona, which is technically sodium sesquicarbonate, which is 1 molar ratio each of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate in a blended state. And that's the natural state of baking soda in the earth, is that it's not entirely baking soda, it's not entirely soda ash, it's a blend, a molar blend, 50-50 molar blend between the two. And that's called trona, the common name. As for borax, it comes in so many different varieties depending on, I don't remember, I don't know what variety it's found in the earth. May not be the same as what you buy 20 mule team, because 20 mule team is hydrated with water, and so it's very easy to dissolve. But there are other varieties of borax that are very difficult to dissolve. Anhydrous, for instance, has no water in it, and it takes a little while to dissolve. So I don't know which variety, but in any case, what I did anyway, to get to the chase, cut to the chase here, trying to figure out again and again, what is the essential features of the Ammann Brothers circuitry for their car, the electric conversion. And it's pretty obvious the steel drum captures the magnetic field coming out of, or redelivers back to the coil inside the drum, possibly the electric field surrounding. See, it's complicated because it's a dynamic situation. The drum is acting as an echo, and it's sending back to the coil a magnetic field because the drum itself has a magnetic field swimming around inside of it. And I won't get into that at the moment. I believe it has to do with eddy currents, but be that as it may, there's the drum, that's the iron. There may have been an iron bolt from top to bottom, from the top plate of the drum, the steel drum, to the bottom plate of the steel drum, acting as the core of their transformer. I'm assuming there's two wires in that situation, not a single wire, because I think that's the only way to get any advantage out of a coil. Maximum advantage is when there's a minimum of two coils wrapped together in close proximity, maximizing their mutual inductance, and having an iron core, and having even more iron than what you can stuff inside the core, extending beyond the core, surrounding the exterior of the coil right up against the outer edge of that coil. So you get a circular arrangement between the core and the outer shell, kind of figure eight, if you look at it sliced down the middle of the steel drum. So there's all your steel, your iron, and the mineral is either borax or baking soda or both, or trona I should say, in electrolyte solution with an aluminum anode for the diode and a, let's say, lead cathode for the other electrode of the diode, for the electrolytic diode, made 100 years ago. So I have two of them here, one here on this loop and one here. Found it worked best to put a capacitor here. I wanted to make sure I had resistance on each of my pathways, so I put in a 1 default ohm resistor in the 4 positions. It's a 5-volt battery, which seemed to work best. I didn't try a 6-volt. 12 I tried, 1 microvolt I tried, and I think I tried 1 volt. And the best results came from the 5-volt. And it just turns out that batteries 100 years ago, car batteries, were not 12-volt like they are today. They were 6-volt batteries. So 5 volts pretty close. So what I figured, okay, what was the purpose of the copper spheres in which they took out the headlights and replaced them with the spheres? And they have a copper tube or rod coming down each sphere into the top plate of the steel drum. What is the purpose of them, and how are they electrically connected to anything if such is the case? And the best I can come up with is that they use their car battery. Each pole of the car battery went to a different copper sphere, and the interior of the sphere is represented by this grounding point. Okay, that's the center of the sphere, is what we put here as a ground. And then the sphere itself is a capacitor along with the air inside of it. So it's a unipolar capacitor in which the center is grounded because it goes nowhere. It's a virtual ground. So we have, it's a virtual plate. It's a plate that doesn't exist. You see, the dielectric is the middle sandwich of the capacitor. The copper sphere is is this represented by the bottom plate of these two capacitors. The top plate does not exist. It's virtual. It disappears into the infinitely small space of the center of the sphere. So there is no internal plate. So consequently, you have to consider that has to go to ground. There's no other way you could simulate it except to send it to ground. Now, I've done much more complicated versions of what I think is happening inside that sphere, but this is the simplest. It's just one capacitor and a ground on one side of it, and the other side goes to the circuit. Well, what is the circuit? Well, if they put each sphere inside the headlight, then I can force, headlights already have the wires coming from the electrical system, so you just use one and you discard the other, and you have an opposite polarity in each case. You test out the polarity, which is which, find out what it is, so that the positive pole of the battery goes to one copper sphere situated in one headlight, and the negative of the battery goes to the other copper sphere. But at the same time, you have a branch coming off that goes to the circuit from each case. So it comes off of, so actually that you get to use the, anyway. So then the lamp was the last thing I put in, but what I put in the transformer to make the loop, and then I wanted to make sure, because it's a DC EV, I'm assuming, simple-minded guys, what would they do? They wouldn't use anything complicated like an AC motor. They'd use a DC motor. So to ensure that this oscillating system operates in a DC manner, that's what I think the purpose of the diodes are for. And since a transformer creates two isolated circuits, I have to put a diode in each circuit. So one goes here to make sure the battery gets recharged. Only negative goes in there. The battery is not allowed to have its current behave in a positive fashion that would indicate a discharging state in this simulator. Not in Berkeley Spice. Everything there they do backwards with regard to current polarity. And then this side of the isolation transformer, so it's 1-to-1 ratio, is, consider it ballast. Sometimes I like to call things in circuits that don't seem to have any useful purpose. Yeah, they do. So, for lack of a better word, we can call this side ballast, because it reinforces and thus stabilizes what's going on over here, which may be very unstable. And that's the problem with free energy circuits. They tend to be unstable. Well, this one blew up in my face. Shows you how unstable it is. But adding the capacitor made all the difference. I tried a resistor, I tried a coil. There's only 3 things to try, right? When you're dealing with analog. So capacitor worked the best, and their default values, all of these, 10 microfarads. It didn't matter what value for the capacitors, what value for the transformer. It did matter the value for the battery. How much voltage. So that's about the only thing that really, I think, matters. And it didn't take long for this thing to blow up, basically. It was pretty instantaneous. I've done a lot of blow-up kaboom circuits in Paul Fawcett simulators, so that's what always makes me suspicious. I don't know about this. So until I do this in Berkeley Spice, I don't know what I'm dealing with. Yet, I have no idea how to simulate the equivalency of magnetically coupling the coil of the transformer to a huge amount of massive iron to create all these eddy currents inside the iron mass. That basically, I think what happens when, William Line quotes Tesla saying that for every 200 pounds of iron added to a special generator, one additional horsepower is added to the output. I think what he's referring to is that the magnetizable iron becomes a current source. What's the definition of a current source? It means the voltage is allowed to vary, but the current is rock steady. And current is the hardest thing to maintain in a circuit. It's usually we find we have a voltage source, and then the current does whatever it wants to do based on all kinds of so-called laws of thermodynamics prohibiting us from having any current to speak of. Usually the easiest thing in the world is create voltage without any current. And thus our power is limited, and how can we boogie in an EV? We just can't. But if we can insert into the circuit a current source, and the current source can provide a substantial amount of current, then we got all the free energy we want to, because the voltage is easy enough to produce practically for nothing. It's the current that's hard to get a hold of. And Oliver Heaviside, the people back in the days of the telegraph, transatlantic telegraph cable, knew that all too well. Current is the hardest thing to come by. So it's the first thing to wonder, how do you solve the problem when you're dealing with an over-unity or a free energy style device? And I suspect that's what Tesla was doing with iron when he magnetically coupled a mass of iron to the iron core of his coils. I think you have to have a minimum of 2 coils, because I think you have to have mutual inductance between them. It's not enough just to have self-inductance of 1 coil. And I think it has to be not DC, it has to be something that alternates, but it doesn't really matter what waveform. In fact, I tested out various waveforms, and I found that a pulse waveform of a pulsed square wave, in which the duty cycle I took to the minimum that the simulator allowed me, 1% on, and then 99% of the time it's off. That was the most efficient waveform of an alternating polarity of voltage to give me maximum gain in Paul Falstad's simulator, namely maximum gain of current. And I'm assuming that would work pretty much with any circuit. Now, in a DC motor situation or a DC generator, they have alternating too. It's called the commutator, but it's square waves. And when you've got square waves, they don't work. You don't get over unity with a 50% duty cycle. It doesn't work. You can have anything else, just so long as it's not 50%. You can have 90, 10, 10, 90, anything you want, just not 100%, not 0%, not 50%. It's got to be something other than those 3 options. And then it works just fine. You don't need a sine wave necessarily, or a triangle wave. Now, sine wave is the worst, actually. Because it spends too much time. See, since the pulse wave was the best, we want to spend as little time as possible at the 2 nodes, the antinode and the node, the peak and the trough of a wave. As little time as possible. In fact, if there's spikes, even better. And then linger all we want to in between the 2 extremes of maximum and minimum. That's when you get the maximum effect, apparently, because it just shoots right through whatever resistance you have in the circuit to gain over unity. In fact, I was doing this other circuit today, spending all day long with it, and I found I had to use 1,000 volts or thereabouts to get it to wake up. The rest of the time, without 1,000 volts, it just didn't operate. Now, it didn't use any current to speak of, so the wattage was like nanowatts or something, so that was okay. But the volts I had to get up to around 1,000 volts, and the frequency had to be somewhere around 1,000 cycles per second. But I tried out all kinds of waves, and a pulse wave of a square wave of 1% on and 99% off was the best. It was awesome. It gave me pretty good. And I based it on timing. How long does it take to reach a certain point? 5 seconds versus 5.5 seconds versus 4.3 seconds. Ooh, I'll go with the 4.3, and that was the pulse. 1% duty cycle on a square wave. I mean, it's like, okay, that shoots everything else out of the water I presumed about over unity. What's the most efficient way to go about it? Because, you know, you're dealing with 100 years ago, a DC system for a DC EV. What did they have available that would alternate voltage polarity? A commutator on a DC motor. That's it. You know, everything else is straight DC. So, you know, it's good to look at all possibilities and not assume anything. Oh, it's got to be a sine wave. No, because sine waves are the hardest to create a pure sine wave using a digital generator for sine wave generation, because it's very hard to match exactly what a sine wave looks like. But the only way to do it correctly is to use a coil of wire based generator, and you know, turn the darn thing, mechanically turn it, and because any other way, just it sucks. Really, it really sucks. And sometimes you don't want to make things harder for yourself, right? You want to make it as easy as possible. So here's the hint. Hint, hint. You don't need a sine wave, in all likelihood. Here, we just use diodes to create the alternation, along with caps and coils. The diodes are acting as switches, and the caps and coils is creating the oscillation, and we feed it a DC voltage, just 5 volts. So, sometimes you can get away with these things so long as you provide all the other elements to make it work. Because if it's just straight DC, like a flashlight circuit, forget it. I don't know how to create over unity with a simple DC flashlight style waveform. I just haven't the vaguest clue. And I'm not even going to try to imagine either. Because you got to have some kind of electrical reactance is founded on one of the 3 pillars of electrical reactance is frequency. So how are you going to do that in a DC flashlight style waveform? I wouldn't, or lack of waveform. I mean, it just boggles my brain. I couldn't imagine it happening. Okay, what else? So the problem here that I attempted to solve, and possibly maybe I succeeded in hopefully simplifying things, was I didn't like the complexity of how I was electrically emulating a copper sphere or a bronze sphere. How do you emulate that in a simulator? And I was doing it so complicated. There's a vast simplest, provided we thoroughly understand what the copper sphere represents. I know it represents a capacitor, but what kind of capacitor? And so I guess, being that I'm not that smart, I have to start with the complicated version and keep whittling away at it, pruning away at it, until there's as little as possible, and it describes the situation the best way possible, the most direct way, and that is a virtual. One side of the capacitor is virtual. It doesn't actually exist. It goes off into nothingness. And the outside of, and the metallic sphere itself is the bottom plate here, is the actual plate. So it's a monopole capacitor, is what it amounts to. And this is how you depict it, a capacitor that goes immediately to ground. How hard can that be? And 1 ohm resistance for the resistance of the copper sphere, swimming around inside that copper shell. Okay, whatever. Okay, enough said, I think. There you got it. It's a pretty simple circuit. Burn it in your brain, I can't wait to try it out in either LT Spice or Microcap, for that matter. Because nothing I do in Berkeley Spice works like it works in Paul Falstad Simulator. So you gotta wonder, okay, it may not work at all. Okay, Vinny, what have you been smoking? Nothing. I'm an asthmatic. I don't have to smoke anything. I'm high on lack of oxygen all the time. So, if you can call that high. Inebriated by being suffocated. Lifelong suffocation. Well, isn't that what asthmatics go through? Even if they're not having trouble breathing, apparently. It's burned into their brain from childhood. Oh, yeah, I don't want to go through that again. Don't look forward to that. Whatever. Enough.